Hey, welcome to the Riverside. This is Avett's story about the heron. Whitaker came home from school last week talking about dinosaurs. He said some of the kids at school were talking about these creatures that lived millions of years ago. I asked him what a million was, and he told me it was 1,000 thousands. When he saw the confusion in my eyes, he told me to look at the trees and try to count the leaves that had just burst into green this spring. I looked at the thousands of trees and said there was no way I could ever count all the leaves, and he told me that was what a million was. Since I am only 3 years old, I looked at 3 leaves and realized that millions of years must have been a really long time ago. He then told me about the creatures the kids were talking about and how there were some that were bigger than our house, while some had necks so long they could reach the top of a maple tree in our front yard. Since I only weigh 8 pounds, I realized these things were so massive that there is no way I would ever want to meet one. So I'm kind of glad they are extinct. Whitaker told me extinct means that a species has died off completely. He told me about this one dinosaur that could fly and said it was called a pterodactyl. I tried to imagine this ancient bird he was telling me about because he said one of the kids told him that if he grew wings, he'd be about the length of a pterodactyl. Whitaker is 10 times as big as me, so I was pretty blown away by the size these birds must have been. Then he told me they only weighed about the same as I do. I couldn't even begin to imagine how something so big could weigh so little. But I kept thinking about it. As we went for a walk, I kept thinking about the giant birds and creatures Whitaker had been telling me about. Sometimes I wish I could go to school like Whitaker because he gets to learn about all kinds of different things. Sometimes I feel a little dumb because I don't know a fraction of the things he does. But he's a good teacher and has been trying to teach me about math and other stuff. It's a strange concept, but it's beginning to make sense to me. He says his favorite thing is when kids read to him because he always gets to learn new things. So when we arrived at the river today, I was shocked to see a bird I had never seen before. And it was huge. It was standing in the shallow water where I like to swim. And at first I thought about running at it and chasing it away from my spot. But then I thought about the pterodactyl that Whitaker had been telling me about last week. He had told me they were meat eaters, and that made me stop where I was, because I didn't want to be dinner for this giant bird that looked like it was waiting for me. Its legs were really long, and it also had a long neck. Whitaker had also stopped and was watching the bird in the water. I asked, "Do you think it's a pterodactyl?" "No way, pup," he says. "I told you that the dinosaurs went extinct millions of years ago." He went on to say that he heard Jig telling some of the students that there was a theory that dinosaurs evolved into birds, and the kids said they knew this because they had seen a movie called Jurassic Park. Now, I love going to parks, but if there is a park for dinosaurs, I want to stay far away from it. I asked him if he knew what kind of bird this was, and he told me he thought it was a heron. I'd never heard of a heron before, but it looked different than every other bird I have ever seen. I was starting to feel braver as we stood there watching it dip its beak into the water. I liked this bird a lot more than I did the noisy geese I saw a few weeks ago. This bird looked very peaceful and kind of majestic standing in the water. I realized I wasn't scared and started inching closer to the heron because I had a few questions I wanted to ask it. As I slowly approached, it raised its head and turned in my direction. "Excuse me," I said. "My name is Avett, and that's Whitaker over there. I've heard about you both." But among the river animals, he is known as the ambassador, and you're the interpreter. But most of the animals call you Little Eye. What do you want? Well, Whitaker was telling me about these giant winged dinosaurs that lived millions of years ago, and you look like you could be one of its descendants. I told it. What are you trying to say, Little Eye? It asked. Well, I was wondering about these things all week since he told me about them, and now I see you standing in the river, and you look very much like what I pictured in my head when he was telling me about the pterodactyl. I assure you I'm not a pterodactyl, it told me. I'm a giant blue heron, and my kind have fished the river around here for many years. And with that, it took flight, which made it look even more like the pterodactyl Whitaker had been telling me about. Its wings were as long as its body, and it flapped them in a majestic kind of way. As Whitaker and I walked home, I had a million questions, and since he's the smartest dog I know, I asked him a bunch of them. He knew about a lot of the things I was asking, but when I asked him what evolution was, he didn't know how to explain it. We walked along in silence for a little bit before he stopped by the place we had seen the deer carcass during the winter. Remember when we saw the wolf? He asked me, as if I could ever forget that scary creature. Well, there is a theory that we dogs evolved from wolves. I looked at him in shock before saying, You're telling me that I evolved from a wolf? That's what I'm saying, pup. Wolves are our wild ancestors, but long ago our kind became domesticated. I love when Whitaker uses big words, but I always have to ask him what they mean, and thankfully he's good at breaking things down so I can understand. He went on to tell me how humans started breeding dogs for qualities they wanted in a pet, and eventually there became so many different kinds of dogs with different sizes and shapes. It made me think how maybe that was what evolution was, the changing of something over many, many years. As I watched the heron fly away, I thought about all the kinds of birds I have seen and wondered if maybe all those birds were the descendants of dinosaurs from long ago. Thanks for listening.